Imagine this. You wake up in the middle of the forest. The air is heavy, the silence is absolute, but something moves in the darkness. First, a slight tingling, then an unbearable burning sensation, and then the terror reveals itself. Thousands of ravenous creatures devouring you alive. What would you do if they were already inside your mouth? Time's up. Your only way out is to watch until the end. Subscribe now.
Imagine this. You awaken in the middle of a dense forest, the air thick with humidity and mystery. The darkness around you feels alive, pulsating, as if something is lurking in the shadows. The silence is absolute, but suddenly a faint sound breaks the monotony, the rustling of leaves, a whisper barely perceptible in the wind. Your body is cold, your skin bristling with goosebumps, and then you feel it, something crawling. At first, it's just a strange tingling on your arms and legs, like tiny insects walking over you. Nothing unusual for someone deep in the jungle. But within seconds, the sensation shifts. It turns into discomfort. Then, an unbearable burning, your heart races. You reach for your arm, trying to brush off whatever is there. And that's when the horror reveals itself. Thousands of small, black, glossy bodies squirm across your skin, covering every inch of you in a chaotic frenzy. Survival instinct takes over. You try to shake them off, rip them away, crush them. But the more you move, the worse it gets. Tiny, razor-sharp mandibles dig into your flesh, tearing away microscopic pieces. They aren't just biting, they are devouring you. Panic peaks. You jump to your feet, but the damp, muddy ground is unforgiving. Your foot slips, you fall, and now they are everywhere. On your legs, on your arms, on your neck, inside your clothes, inside your mouth. Desperation consumes you. Your heart pounds in your chest, your lungs beg for air, but your mind can only focus on one thing. How do you escape this nightmare? Your body starts to fail, your vision blurs, the throbbing pain is overwhelming. What was once a mild discomfort has become a living nightmare. And then a question chills you to the bone. Is this real, or is it the beginning of the end? Hours before the horror, the sun was already sinking behind the dense canopy of trees as Lucas Almeida ventured deeper into the tropical forest. To him, it was just another day of exploration. Adventure was in his blood, his very nature. He had already faced deadly snakes, treacherous storms, and even predators that made him question if he would make it out alive. But none of that could have prepared him for the true nightmare that lurked in the shadows. Because in the jungle, danger doesn't always have sharp claws or venomous fangs. Sometimes it's small, tiny, invisible, until it's too late. The air was thick, humid, the scent of damp vegetation mixed with the natural perfume of soaked earth. Every step took him deeper into the unknown. He dodged branches, leapt over protruding roots, moving with the confidence of someone who had seen it all. But without realizing it, his steps had led him straight into a hunting ground. Beneath his feet, something stirred. A silent army lay in wait, watching. And then they attacked. At first, it was subtle, just a few ants, tiny and swift, crawling up his boots, his ankles, blending in with the moss and leaves, invisible, relentless, multiplying by the second. They were already in his clothes, on his skin, but he didn't know it yet. The first sign came as a quiet warning, a faint tingling, a barely noticeable bite. Nothing that alarmed him. He kept going. After all, the danger seemed invisible, but the attack had already begun. Seconds later, the burning intensified. First, an itch, then an unbearable sting, like needles piercing his skin all at once. Dozens, hundreds, thousands. Panic struck fast. He stopped, looked around. Nothing but the damp darkness of the forest. But when he looked down, That's when he saw the crawling horror that had already taken over him. The nightmare materialized. Lucas Almeida's heart pounded, his breath caught in his throat, and for one terrifying moment, time seemed to slow. What he was seeing was worse than any fevered hallucination, worse than any sweat-drenched nightmare. His legs, were no longer his own. They were covered by a living mass, a crawling ocean of darkness, writhing and surging in a frenzy. Thousands of glossy black bodies shimmered under the dim forest light, climbing in an unstoppable wave, sinking their razor-sharp mandibles into his burning flesh. Microscopic wounds split open across his skin. Blood trickled down in tiny crimson rivers. Panic detonated inside him. His instincts screamed. He kicked, thrashed, clawed at his legs, desperately trying to shake them off. But then he made his first fatal mistake. The ants did not retreat. On the contrary, they spread even faster. Some tumbled down into his boots, others scurried up his torso, past his belt, reaching his waist. The air around him thickened with a sickly, sweet chemical scent, alarm pheromones. The swarm was now in a frenzy. The pain struck like a sledgehammer of fire. Each bite burned like smoldering embers being pressed into his skin. Desperation screamed through his veins. He tried to run, but the treacherous, rain-soaked ground betrayed him. His foot slipped, his body collapsed, sinking into the damp earth. And that was when the real disaster unfolded. The ants were everywhere now, inside his clothes, slithering beneath his shirt, creeping up his neck, scaling his back. Some squeezed through his sleeves, others burrowed into his waistband. The nightmare slithered over him, ravenous, merciless. The ground was alive, and it was devouring him. His vision blurred. His blood pounded so violently he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The pain, the fear, the sheer suffocating terror. His body was no longer his own. And then, the worst. Something moved inside his mouth. He tried to scream, but the moment he opened his lips, the ants crawled in, the nightmare inside him. The sensation was suffocating. The bitter taste of the ants burned his mouth, spreading an acidic venom that made his tongue tingle. He tried to spit, cough, breathe, but they were everywhere. Some crawled down his throat, others latched onto his gums, writhing between his teeth. It was like swallowing pure agony. He was drowning in terror. Panic took hold of him, but something deep inside screamed for him to stop. If he kept fighting like this, he wouldn't stand a chance. At that moment, a thought cut through his desperation like a cold blade. Stopping might be the only way to win. His body begged for panic. His instincts roared at him to run, to claw the ants off in a desperate explosion of fury. But then he realized they were reacting to movement. The more he struggled, the more frenzied their attack became. He needed control. With superhuman effort, he forced himself to stay still. He held his breath, feeling the swarm crawl and writhe across his skin. Every muscle in his body trembled with revulsion. But he didn't give in, he waited, and then slowly he began to roll toward an area with less vegetation. If he wanted to survive, he had to get out of the swarm's path. His body screamed in agony, every bite seared like molten iron against his flesh. His arms and legs were raw, his skin torn open in countless places, but he couldn't stop. That's when he saw the one thing that could save him. A stream, just a few meters away. Every step was hell. The ants still clung to his flesh, their mandibles tearing away microscopic pieces of him. The venom was already in his bloodstream, making his muscles spasm, draining his strength. But none of that mattered. The water was his only chance. With one final burst of energy, he threw himself into the stream. The impact was like being reborn. The rushing water ripped the cursed creatures from his body, washing his nightmare away. For the first time, he could breathe, but the danger wasn't over. The venom was already working. His body was failing, his muscles locked up, his vision blurred, distorted, spinning in shadows and flashes of light. If he didn't get help soon, it might be too late. And then, a sound, something, or someone, was approaching. Luck was his only ally. As Lucas Almeida's body fought against the effects of the venom, one brutal truth became evident. He had survived by a thread. Many aren't as lucky. Carnivorous ants are not just ordinary insects. They are nature's executioners, designed to destroy anything that crosses their path. They feel no fear. They do not retreat. They do not stop. Throughout history, terrifying accounts have proven that the size of the prey doesn't matter. If a swarm decides to attack, it wins, always. Among the most feared species, one stands out, the army ant, Eciton burchelli. Found across Central and South America, these ants don't build permanent nests. They are always on the move, advancing like a murderous tide, eradicating everything in their way. Their mandibles don't just bite, they slice through flesh like razor-sharp blades. But there is an even worse species, the bullet ant, Paraponera clavata. Its venom is so excruciating that victims describe it as being shot with a burning bullet, a pain so unbearable, so mind-shattering that it can last for up to 24 hours. And the worst part? They never attack alone. Swarms of these ants can strip an entire animal to the bone within minutes. There are reports of cattle being reduced to skeletons in just a few hours. In some remote regions, locals whisper dark stories of small animals and even people who vanished without a trace. For Lucas, this wasn't just an attack, it was a warning. In the wild, true terror doesn't come from the massive creatures you can see, it comes from the ones you barely notice until it's too late. Lucas Almeida survived. But the scars of that day never faded. His body bore the marks of the attack, but the real wound was in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel the tearing bites, the burning skin, the terror crawling over him. The desperation of that night never left him. He knew that if he had made just one more mistake, he might never have made it out of that jungle alive. And every time he told his story, the same question always came up. Would you have been able to escape? The truth? Most people wouldn't. The natural instinct would be to panic, to run, to struggle, exactly what the ants expect, because the more the prey fights, the more vulnerable it becomes, the faster it tires, the sooner it gives in. But now you know the answer. If you ever find yourself surrounded by these deadly creatures, remember this: never panic. Sudden movements release more pheromones, attracting even more ants. Get out of the infested area as quickly as possible, but stay in control. Don't draw more attention to the swarm. Use water, fire, or smoke to drive them away. These elements disrupt their communication and can save your life. Avoid sitting or lying down in unknown areas of the jungle. One mistake could be your last. The jungle hides dangers most people can't even imagine. And now you've seen what a swarm can do to the human body. But tell me, what would you do if you were in Lucas's place? Leave a comment below and share this video with someone who needs to know this. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. The silence of the night was shattered by something sinister. Faint cracking sounds echoed in the darkness, almost imperceptible, but then came the horror. The ground moved as if it were alive. A black carpet advanced without mercy. Homes invaded, wires burning, bodies disappearing, but the worst was yet to come. Millions of creatures emerged from underground, and nothing seemed capable of stopping them. But the question no one can answer is, are they already closer than we imagine? Get ready to discover the invasion that science cannot explain. The silence of the night was interrupted by a disturbing sound. At first, it was subtle, faint crackling noises, almost imperceptible, echoing through the ground as if something were crawling in the darkness. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. At dawn, the city woke up to a scene of pure terror. The ground was no longer the same. It seemed to move, undulating like a living organism. A black, pulsating carpet spread through streets, yards, and plazas. Millions of tiny creatures marched in unison, consuming everything in their path. Plants withered at their touch, small animals were reduced to bones in minutes, and then came the pain. An unbearable pain. Barefoot residents stepped unknowingly onto the ground, and within seconds their feet burned as if they were being scorched alive. These were no ordinary ants. They were predators, hunters, and nothing seemed capable of stopping them. Now imagine waking up to find your entire city under attack. You open the door and see a scene straight out of a nightmare. Houses invaded, wires melting inside the walls, appliances burning, power poles sparking. The streets unrecognizable. People ran in panic, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The swarm covered everything, devoured everything, as if something much greater was controlling their every move. This wasn't just an infestation, it was a coordinated attack, a subterranean army rising to claim territory. But the question no one could answer was, where did they come from? How could something so small become such a massive threat? And most terrifying of all, could they already be closer than we imagine? The truth is, this story is not fiction. Super colonies like this have appeared before. They are spreading across the world, growing larger every year. And today you're going to learn about one of the most destructive ever recorded, an ant colony capable of wiping out an entire community. You'll understand what happened, how experts tried and failed to contain it, and why this danger may be much closer than any of us would like to believe. The invasion seemed endless. The ground swarmed, the walls trembled, and the residents, overcome with desperation, struggled to comprehend the impossible. How could something so small act with such precision? How could millions of ants move as one entity, advancing without resistance, consuming everything in their path? But the worst was yet to come. The true enemy was not just on the surface, it was lurking underground. What was ravaging that community was not an ordinary infestation, it was a super colony. Unlike normal colonies where a single queen rules a limited territory, super colonies operate like invisible empires. They have no borders, no internal rivals. Instead of competing and destroying each other like most ant species, they unite. They create massive underground networks interconnected by endless tunnels, housing millions, perhaps billions, of workers with one absolute purpose: to grow, conquer, and eliminate any obstacle in their path. Imagine a hidden civilization where every individual follows silent, instinctive orders. There is no hesitation, no chaos. Each ant knows exactly what to do. And so they march, they wipe out native species, devour entire crops, consume wooden structures as if they were made of paper. And the worst part? They never stop. Super colonies never stop. As long as resources exist, they will continue to spread, dominate territories, and multiply. Science has already documented terrifying cases. In 2002, researchers discovered a super colony stretching over 6,000 kilometers, covering Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Billions of interconnected ants operating as a single organism, an underground army advancing unchecked. Now ask yourself, if something of this scale already exists, what's stopping an even larger colony from forming at this very moment right beneath our feet? That community had no idea, but they were facing one of these invisible monsters. Except this super colony was different. something even more terrifying. It wasn't just enormous, it was carnivorous. Its diet wasn't limited to leaves or seeds. Small animals vanished, entire gardens turned to dust, wooden structures were consumed within hours. And now they were about to discover that its hunger had no limits. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an out-of-control infestation. Something that, with time, would simply go away. But soon, the residents realized they were wrong. Terribly wrong. These ants weren't just occupying territory, they were hunting. Small insects began to disappear, then smaller birds, but within days the situation escalated into something unthinkable. Dogs, cats, even farm animals were found dead, reduced to nothing but clean bones. These carnivorous ants were unlike anything ever seen before. They didn't attack randomly. Every strike was calculated, strategic. They moved like a coordinated swarm, surrounding their prey from all sides. It took only minutes for thousands of them to cover an entire body, tearing through muscle and tissue with their razor-sharp mandibles. And the worst part? They didn't just bite, they injected venom. A lethal toxin capable of preventing blood clotting, keeping the victim vulnerable until nothing remained but bones. But the true horror was yet to come. Their destruction wasn't limited to animals. They were predators of anything containing organic matter. Entire trees were consumed down to their roots. Houses began to collapse. Wooden walls were eaten away from the inside out. By the time the residents realized the danger, it was already too late. The threat had already infiltrated their own homes. Ants emerged from the plumbing, climbed the walls, and slipped into every hidden corner. The smell of burning began to spread across the city. Electrical wires were being devoured, causing blackouts, short circuits, and sudden fires. The environment was changing, and not for the better. The super colony wasn't just invading, it was reshaping the territory to its own design. Panic took over. The residents tried to fight back. They locked themselves inside, sprayed pesticides, lit fires to keep them away. But nothing worked. These ants weren't normal. They didn't retreat. They didn't die from poison. Every attempt to exterminate them only made them migrate, expanding their zone of destruction even further. They were winning. And then came the attacks on humans. At first, it was just bites, small irritations easy to ignore. But at night, the horror revealed itself in its cruelest form. People woke up covered in them. It was impossible to get them all off. Some victims couldn't call for help in time. Others suffered fatal allergic reactions. The entire city was turning into a hunting ground. And now, the next targets were the people themselves. The first warning came from a local farmer. Something was wrong. The cattle were restless. The animals refused to leave the barn, as if they sensed an invisible danger lurking nearby. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found at dawn. In the middle of the pasture, a calf lay motionless. Its body was unrecognizable, exposed bones, clean, with no traces of flesh or blood around. The most terrifying part? There were no signs of predators, no struggle marks. It was as if something had devoured the animal, silently, during the night. But that was just the beginning. Days later, the terror spread. Bees vanished from entire hives. Small birds fell lifeless from their nests. Rodents disappeared without a trace. Nature was silently collapsing, but no one could have imagined that the real nightmare was still to come. The community only realized the severity of the situation when the ants started entering their homes. At first, it was just a few insects appearing through cracks in the floor, along the window frames. But then, within hours, hundreds, then thousands, began to spread. They came from everywhere, from the ceiling, from the pipes, from electrical outlets. Some residents woke up in the middle of the night, feeling something crawling on their skin. The shock came when they turned on the lights. Their bodies were covered by a black wave, a swarm of ravenous insects. Panic took over the town. Entire families fled in the dead of night, screaming, running, trying to escape the relentless bites. Some suffered severe allergic reactions. Others had red, swollen eyes, burning from the acid the ants secreted. The houses were no longer safe. Neither were the streets, nor the fields. There was no refuge. Authorities were called, but no one knew what to do. Pesticides didn't work. Burning them didn't work. It was as if an invisible force was consuming the town from within, devouring everything in its path. Now the question was no longer how this had started. The real question was how to stop something that seemed impossible to contain. The sun had barely risen, but something was wrong. The landscape looked different. The once lush green fields were now dry, lifeless, as if something invisible had swept through overnight. Farmers noticed their crops were disappearing abnormally fast. Entire cornfields were reduced to bare stalks in a single night. Grain stored in silos was being consumed from the inside out. But why? What could be devouring everything without leaving a trace? The answer came in the most brutal way. One of the farmers, suspicious, tried to pull a plant from the ground. But as he did, he felt the earth shift. Small cracks opened in the soil. And then a black swarm emerged. These weren't just a few ants. It was a living, pulsating wave, a tide of predators rising from the depths. Within seconds, the ground beneath them revealed a deadly labyrinth. Underground tunnels stretched for miles. The entire town was built on a minefield, and no one had any idea. As the fields were consumed, the homes were invaded even more aggressively. During the day, the ants hid. They moved stealthily through cracks in the walls, behind furniture, into the darkest corners of the houses. But at night, they took control. Nothing was safe. Books were devoured. Clothes disappeared, reduced to shreds. Wooden furniture was eaten away. And then came the worst. Mattresses started being infiltrated. The simple act of sleeping became a deadly risk. Some victims woke up feeling something crawling beneath their sheets, but by the time they tried to move, it was already too late. And that wasn't all. The lights flickered, electrical systems failed, outlets burst into flames without warning. The ants were attacking the wiring inside homes, chewing through cables, triggering short circuits. Some houses caught fire from the inside, forcing entire families to flee in terror in the middle of the night. There was no more safety. Not inside, not outside. Desperation spread. Within days, it felt like the entire town was losing the battle. But the worst was yet to come. When the first reports of direct attacks on humans emerged, it became clear that this wasn't just an infestation. It was a massacre, and the enemy was invisible, relentless, and unstoppable. Fear spread like wildfire. What once seemed like isolated cases quickly turned into an epidemic of terror. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Patients arrived covered in bites, some suffering severe allergic reactions, others in a state of absolute shock. The reports were always the same. The ants were everywhere, climbing up legs, infiltrating clothes, covering entire bodies within seconds. It was impossible to remove them without being bitten dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. But the true horror began when the stories took an even darker turn. Some families swore they could hear a constant sound coming from inside the walls at night, a relentless rustling, as if something was crawling within them. Others noticed their food supplies vanishing from the pantry within hours. It was as if an invisible army was consuming everything from the inside out. The town went into a state of emergency. Authorities tried to contain the panic, but there was no hiding the truth anymore. They were facing something beyond human control. Pesticide trucks were brought in, mass spraying was conducted in homes, streets, and farmlands. But nothing worked. The ants simply reorganized. They didn't die, they adapted. Every attempt to exterminate them only forced them to migrate, spreading the chaos even further. And then basic services began to collapse. Schools were shut down. Teachers found swarms emerging from lockers and desks, turning classrooms into infestation zones. Restaurants closed in a hurry. Food supplies were contaminated. The power grid became unstable. The colonies had now infiltrated electrical poles, chewing through wires, triggering blackouts, and sparking fires. There was no more doubt. This wasn't just an infestation, it was a silent war. And the town was losing. The residents were running out of options. Some began to flee, others barricaded themselves in their homes, hoping for a miracle. But in the darkness of the night, the true terror reached its peak. A scream shattered the silence. Someone was crying for help, a desperate, blood-curdling scream that was suddenly cut off. And then came the absolute silence. The scream shattered the silence of the night. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a sound of pure desperation, a horrifying plea, followed by a dull thud, something hitting the floor. And then silence. Neighbors rushed to see what was happening. The door was slightly open, the house was swallowed in darkness. Inside, a cold, shadowy room. But what stood out the most was what looked like a black carpet moving across the floor. When the lights flicked on, the horror revealed itself. A woman lay collapsed beside her bed. Her body was covered, but not by a blanket. Thousands of ants crawled across her skin, spreading like a living shroud. They were everywhere, burrowing under her clothes, invading her eyes, her ears, her nostrils. She didn't move. People tried to help. In desperation, they banged on the walls, threw water, shook her. But nothing worked. With every attempt, a new swarm emerged. It was as if the entire house was alive. And that night was only the beginning. Reports of attacks exploded. In less than 24 hours, at least 10 people were rushed to hospitals. Some covered in bites, others in shock. Some didn't survive. What had once been just an infestation had become a massacre. Experts were called in, but what they discovered was even more terrifying. These ants weren't behaving like any known species. They weren't just defending themselves, they were eliminating everything in their path. Their attacks were organized, synchronized, an invisible, relentless war. Their mandibles were sharp enough to tear human flesh with ease, and their venom caused an unbearable burning sensation. For some, extreme discomfort. For others, a fatal collapse. The town was on the verge of collapse. Many fled, abandoning their homes, their belongings, everything they had. Others had nowhere to go. They sealed their doors and windows, hoping to hold out. But everyone knew the truth. The ants were winning. And with each passing night, more bodies were found. The city had to fight back. Panic had already taken hold. The streets were empty. The air was thick with the scent of burning and poison. Time was running out. Either they found a way to contain the super colony, or they would be devoured. Pest control specialists were rushed in. They brought equipment, cutting-edge chemicals. It was the last hope. The first attempt was a massive chemical assault. Trucks rolled through the city, releasing thick clouds of industrial poison. Houses, fields, businesses, everything was blanketed in a toxic mist. But when the smoke cleared, the reality was terrifying. The ants were still there. Some had died, but the colony remained intact. The chemical attack had failed, so they turned to something more drastic. If they couldn't kill them with poison, they would try to burn them. The city was locked down. The surrounding fields were set ablaze. A ring of fire was created to contain the colony's spread. For hours, the flames consumed crops, pastures, entire stretches of land. But then came the truth. The fire had failed too. The ants simply migrated. They reorganized underground, and they emerged in new parts of the city. Now they were more spread out, more unstoppable than ever. And the worst was yet to come. Researchers made a shocking discovery. Some ants had developed chemical resistance. They were adapting, learning to survive, becoming stronger. It was a losing war. Supermarkets shut down, schools and hospitals were abandoned. The streets became danger zones. There was no electricity, no food. Now people had only two choices: resist or flee. But where? The city was under siege, the super colony was advancing, and then, in the middle of the chaos, an unthinkable solution emerged. Something so improbable, so absurd, that no one believed it could possibly work. But it was their only chance to survive. Faced with the failure of conventional strategies, scientists and pest control specialists were called in for one final attempt. There was no more time for temporary solutions. The city was on the brink of collapse, and the only way forward was to find an entirely new approach to fighting the super colony. The answer came from nature itself. In previous studies on invasive ant colonies, scientists had observed a pattern. Some rival species were capable of wiping out entire super colonies when competing for territory. The idea was risky, but it could be their only hope. The plan was to introduce a predatory species, an enemy ant capable of hunting and eliminating the invaders from the inside out. Researchers brought in warrior ants known for their aggression and territorial behavior. The introduction of the new species was done strategically in the most heavily infested areas where the carnivorous swarms were concentrated. At first, there was no guarantee it would work, but after a few days, the first signs of change began to appear. The swarms started to shrink. The underground tunnels of the carnivorous ants were gradually overtaken by the new predators. Bit by bit, territory was reclaimed, and areas that had once been infested showed signs of recovery. It was an invisible war waged beneath the surface, where two forces of nature fought for dominance. However, this plan was not without risks. What would happen if the new species also spiraled out of control? Was the city simply replacing one problem with another? Still, it was the only strategy that showed real results. Over time, the people began to notice that the attacks were decreasing. The overwhelming terror gave way to cautious relief. But that didn't mean the danger was over. The city could finally breathe again. But the battle wasn't fully won. And for some families, it was already too late. The evacuation of parts of the region became inevitable. The underground battle between the ants raged on, but for many residents it was already too late. The city was in ruins. The once bustling streets were now deserted. Houses had been abandoned in a hurry, doors left wide open, furniture overturned. A war zone. Faced with the severity of the situation, the government ordered the immediate evacuation of part of the region. It was no longer safe to stay. The first to leave were those who had lost everything. Some had seen their homes destroyed by fires caused by electrical short circuits. Others simply couldn't bear to live surrounded by an invisible enemy any longer. Moving trucks were seen driving away, carrying the last remnants of families that would never return. The exodus became inevitable. But for those who chose to stay, reality was even worse. The food supply was uncertain, the stockpiles were contaminated, electricity flickered on and off, public services were on the verge of collapse. The government sent teams to monitor the situation, but no one knew how long it would take for the city to recover. Meanwhile, scientists continued to observe the invisible war happening beneath the surface. The predatory ants were winning, but it was a slow process. Months, maybe years, before the super colony was completely eradicated, and for many that was time they simply couldn't afford to wait. The city that once pulsed with life was now a portrait of abandonment. Streets covered in debris, empty schools, businesses in ruins. The silence was unsettling, and at night the only sound that still echoed was the noise from beneath the ground, a sinister reminder that the enemy was still there, hiding, waiting. But had it really ended, or was this just the beginning of something even bigger? Months passed, and little by little, the city began to rebuild itself. Some families returned, services were restored, businesses attempted to reopen. The eerie silence that once dominated the streets was replaced by cautious movement. But even so, fear lingered in the air. No one was certain if the danger had truly disappeared. The underground battle seemed won. But was it? Scientists continued monitoring the area. They collected samples, analyzed tunnel activity. And then the discovery came. The super colony had not been completely eradicated. There were still signs of activity. Small groups persisted. Underground tunnels remained intact. And the most terrifying part, smaller colonies had begun appearing in isolated locations. The threat could return at any moment. But the worst was yet to come. A recent report revealed something even more alarming. Researchers had identified traces of the same ant species, miles away from the city, in places where they had never been seen before. Could part of the super colony have fragmented and migrated? If that was true, the infestation might only be beginning, and the next attack could happen anywhere. Without warning, experts were clear: this case was not an isolated incident. In recent years, invasive ant colonies have been documented in various parts of the world, growing silently, spreading uncontrollably. What happened in this city may have only been a warning. If these creatures find the perfect conditions to thrive, nothing will stop them from becoming the next great biological disaster. And the worst part? At this very moment, a new swarm could be forming. Invisible, underground, waiting for the right moment to emerge, when no one expects it. The story of this city may seem like an isolated case, but the truth is far more terrifying. The world has already witnessed multiple invasions of super colonies. Some were contained in time, others continue to grow silently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. What happened here wasn't just an event, it was a warning, a reminder that the smallest of creatures can become the greatest of threats, capable of turning entire cities into uninhabitable zones. And the scariest part? This wasn't the only documented super colony. There are records of invasive ants on multiple continents. Some traveled unnoticed on ships, inside cargo shipments, even hidden in tourists' luggage, crossing borders, crossing oceans, without anyone realizing it. What if the next great attack is already underway? What if, at this very moment, a subterranean colony is growing beneath our feet, waiting to emerge when no one expects it? Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Do you believe these colonies could become a real threat in the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share your ideas. Let's keep this discussion going and uncover what science has yet to reveal. If you enjoyed this content and want more intriguing and terrifying stories like this, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep bringing you gripping investigations and shocking reports. And stay alert, because while we speak, a new threat may already be rising somewhere on the planet, maybe closer than we think.